All right. Allow me to introduce our keynote speaker, Meg Sattler, who leads Ground Truth Solutions, an international non-governmental organization that aims to ensure that crisis-affected people have a say in the decisions that impact their lives. From beginnings in journalism, Meg has spent most of her career working to improve accountability to people in crisis from different angles in programming in Haiti, Pakistan, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, and Nepal, and more recently in global policy, holding advisory roles at the UN, OCHA, WFP, the START Network, and more. Meg sits on several boards, including the Danish Emergency Relief Fund, H2H Network, and Bendigo Community Bank. She's advised many high-level processes on accountability and humanitarian reform. Please put your hands together to welcome Meg Sattler to the stage.
It's a tough act to follow everything that happened this morning, so I'm going to do my best, and forgive me if I let you down. I just want to say a huge thank you to Mariana and colleagues for having me. And I had sort of some things planned to talk about, but then yesterday, Tamam stole all of them. So I've had to do a quick little pivot. And last night I started thinking about this idea of wisdom that comes from the family. And I thought about it because Patrick from the New Humanitarian, who is here somewhere, and I'm a super fan of his, but I've never met him, he wrote this really thought-provoking article about his grandma yesterday, and I'd really encourage everyone to read it. Tamam yesterday shared this really profound quote in Arabic that his dad used to share with him, and that made him think about how he could improve his work and this weird sector that we live in. And I want to share a country Australian version of that. So to come to this conference, I had to drop my dog off with my dad. And my dad is a man who takes no prisoners and is very rough around the edges. And he said, "Oh, what are you going to do when you're in Doha?" And I gave him this big speech about how we're all coming together at this really pivotal time and we're having all of these big ideas and there's an amazingly diverse group of people and it's this huge opportunity to change things. And he sort of nodded and he didn't really say anything. And then my mum came in and said, "Oh, why are you going to Doha?" And without missing a beat, my dad turned to her and said, "Oh, she's just going to talk shit again." And my dad is a person who has been both on the giving and the receiving end of various kinds of assistance, and he's got a very refined radar. He's also a man of letters, he's a lover of literature and protest, and he's not someone who doesn't understand the power of words. And so I take his words as a challenge, and I hope we're not talking rubbish today. I hope that the many little seeds that have been planted will grow into something real. But I also think, despite what he says, that talking is important. And I think voices are important. And if voices weren't important, the richest people on earth wouldn't be trying so hard to silence them right now. If voices weren't powerful, they wouldn't be considered a threat in a place like Myanmar. So what is the role of talking? Who deserves to be heard? What is the story that we want to tell? What is the new story that we want to tell? Someone said really beautifully on a panel yesterday, our role is not only about aid, but to amplify voices. And so let's talk about voices and how they can be better used as a superpower in this new world order. To do that, I want to take you back to a day that really sort of shattered my illusions of humanity. It was in October 2023, and it wasn't October 7. It was October 14. On that day, Australia held a referendum, and the referendum was to decide whether the Indigenous inhabitants of Australia, the First Peoples of Australia, should have a voice to Parliament. That was all, nothing more than that, just a voice to be able to have a say in their own country. And the Australian public overwhelmingly voted no. And I was sitting there, it was a day that I'll never forget, it was a Saturday, and I was watching that on TV and I was watching the votes come in and I just felt this sort of visceral pain. And on my phone, I was watching Israel's assault into Gaza 7 days after October 7. And something really changed in me. And at that moment, I thought, this is not the world that I thought it was. And that was well before the US election, which I know that we're all talking about as a turning point, but I think evil has been sort of bubbling in this world for a really long time. Things like that tell us that not listening to people is not just an omission, it is an intentional and cruel act of dehumanization. There are so many states that are held up as moral authorities in a humanitarian savior complex that have bloody histories and power structures that silence people either quietly or violently, legally or otherwise. Australia is one of them. In the UK, people are being locked up for protesting climate change. I don't feel I need to talk more about the United States. And so it really struck a chord for me when Patrick wrote of his grandmother, the notion that the West had uniquely codified morality, that it had invented the values undergirding democracy, human rights, and humanitarianism would strike her as deeply flawed, if not outright dishonest. This dishonesty is rampant in a world order that sees nations seek to silence truth tellers every day. But it's also rampant in a humanitarian system that listens to funders and people causing humanitarian crisis more than those affected by them. And so I want to use my time here to take us on a bit of a whistle-stop tour of what people impacted by crisis in 12 countries have shared with us at Ground Truth over the past 2 years. Because when I see information from Tom Fletcher and friends about what the most vital elements of a humanitarian reset are, I find myself wondering how these things fit in. And maybe the answer is they don't. And maybe that's the opportunity that we saw this morning from the amazing leaders who were sitting here. There's a bit of a defeatist attitude, I think, at the moment towards the humanitarian system, but maybe us in this room don't have to be slaves to such a system. If the humanitarian system is so limited, do we have to be humanitarians? Maybe we can simply be humans. A system that feels so limited at a moment in history that needs such radical change could radically change us. That system doesn't have to be us, and we don't have to be it. So after looking through conversations with 34,000 people impacted by crisis, here are the top 5 things that people impacted by crisis tell us that they want us to do. And the first one is to support the importance of what they are doing already through community-led response. That's been a huge part of this conference. I don't feel that I need to talk about it too much. I don't think anyone would disagree with it. But are we very good at supporting that system? No. What would a system look like that really recognised community-led aid? I think it would be one in which we stopped debating neutrality in fancy rooms in Geneva and just focused a bit more on humanity. We would also have to trust each other. But first of all, we would need to count community-led aid as aid. The aid that happens between communities in the first days of a response, or the aid that happens every day in places like Gaza and Sudan and Congo. Nearly everyone that we spoke to in Gaza had provided aid to someone, whether that was food or electricity or shelter, childcare, psychosocial support, just letting someone charge their phone. And all of that is absent in most monitoring frameworks, assessments, and planning. It's completely silent. And when we talk about financial contributions to humanitarianism, funds that come from diaspora are left out, despite the fact that they well exceed traditional humanitarian funding. And when it comes to people hours, data from OECD countries says that most people spend about 45 minutes a day helping other people in their communities. If we assume that in the case of crises, people do much more than that, local communities at a minimum are spending 37 more time on aid and support than aid workers. And even somewhere like Sudan, where we think mutual aid is not silent and it's celebrated, it's still left out of planning, and it's still silenced by a prioritisation of big aid that is stuck at the border. But we can't glorify mutual aid either, especially if we're not prepared to properly support it. In Gaza and Sudan, and now in Myanmar, people really implored us to recognise but not romanticise mutual aid, especially when it's a necessary response to states and systems reneging on their responsibilities and abandoning or destroying people's fundamental rights. How to balance that is a bit tricky, but one clue to do that comes from the second desire of people affected by crisis, which is to recognise a more violent world. This is a huge moment of soul searching for us as a people. There is no successful aid program in Gaza that could clear our conscience. The public is very awake to that, and young people are very awake to that. People who work in rights, Francesca Albanese, not the biggest fan of the humanitarian system. There is no aid program in Congo that could counteract the degree to which that country is being raped so that we can enjoy the latest iPhones, power packs, and electric cars. Ironically, all features of various greening humanitarianism frameworks. If we listen to people in crisis saying thank you for the aid, but what we want is not to die, what we want is our basic right to safety, what can we do? Staying silent under a flimsy cloak of neutrality is not the answer. If we want to rise to the occasion now, we have precedents. We only need to look to the Rwanda inquiry, which scolds states in 1994 for a reluctance to use the term genocide, for a continued emphasis on a ceasefire more than the moral outrage against massacres. And the inquiry said there can be no neutrality in the face of genocide, no impartiality in the face of a campaign to exterminate part of a population. There are actually very few humanitarians who need to remain silent to operate in violent conflict. We have people at this conference today who are managing this every single day. And so particularly those of us who are not in a place where we're wondering if our kids are going to wake up tomorrow or not, we have to really look at our role. The third thing people want is for someone to support their longer-term aspirations and to invest in prevention and recovery. This is what people want, and this is putting people at the centre. And there is a whole humanitarian reset discussion going on at the moment that says do the opposite. To say people deserve to survive and nothing more, that they simply deserve to exist, is not something that we should ever accept. And maybe here we take Mariana's advice and we look at the reset and we say, let them do that. And what can we do? And I think we saw what we can do this morning. As actors and philanthropists and advocates and lawyers and economists and leaders, we shouldn't simply accept a world where people in some places are expected simply to exist and not to be allowed to plan or hope or dream or imagine that their kids might have a decent life. Nobody wants food aid. If there's one thing that we've learned at Ground Truth, it's that. In every crisis, people sell aid so they can think about tomorrow. Fourth, people talk about their right to information. People can't manage their own situations if they don't know what's going on. And people everywhere say that, and then aid agencies try to address that by drip feeding information about when a distribution is on or what their targeting criteria is, but we need radical transparency. And things like saviour complexes that we've spoken about a lot are really perpetuated by agencies that shut people out of decision making and hide the way they use funds in these fancy graphs that no one can understand. But we also need to talk about media monopolies. They perpetuate saver narratives or reduce the lives of people affected by crisis to near nothing, people needing to be fed and watered, instead of real people with flaws and skills and contributions and complexities. There are people that the media right now doesn't recognise as people at all. And these narratives don't start in conversations about aid, but in every broadcast that spreads, whether subtly or not, ideas of white supremacy, male supremacy, and the idea that standing with people who are being bombed out of existence somehow makes you a terrorist. But we also need to be able to challenge aid without fearing that if we do, whole systems will be shut down and more people will die, because actually challenging bad aid might be more life-saving than many of the ideas in the humanitarian reset. And finally, what people want is pretty simple. They want humanitarian assistance to reach the right people with the right stuff at the right time. Most people who receive assistance don't get what they need when they need it most, and they feel that it goes to the wrong people, and that's partly because they're ignored. I'll never forget the man in Chad who told us that he wouldn't eat his food aid because the food he was given was considered in his community food fit for animals. Where did we see that looking different? Maybe Ukraine. Ukraine has been a response that has also been very far from perfect, and we have many reports that say that. But I want us to have a moment of slightly uncomfortable reflection about the racism that underpins why people in Ukraine are treated with levels of dignity not afforded to people in Chad or Sudan. And so if we take this guide from crisis-affected people, knowing also that that information exists in a context where a lot of people haven't been permitted the right to dream or hope for a better future, what can we do? Is this the end of humanitarian exceptionalism? Do we need instead a concerted, diverse response to global evil? And do we fully recognise the weight of the task at hand? When people ask us questions, can we reduce the number of times that we respond, sorry, that's not our mandate? What would humanitarian decision-making look like if every decision-maker had a family member among the affected population? In these decisions where people are playing God, surely there's no better argument for localisation than that. And what would real accountability and solidarity look like from global neighbours? Because localisation also shouldn't mean abandonment. I think we need to get out of the boxes that we've shoved ourselves in. No one's really put us there. I think we've done it to ourselves. Humanitarianism exists in context, and that context is a world with outrageous wealth disparity, hideous taxation policies that keep people poor and let polluters and billionaires thrive, the pillaging of resources and the silencing of the voices that matter most. Humanitarianism exists in a time when we open our phones and we see people in Gaza flying through the air because they've been blown off the face of the earth. Humanitarianism exists in a time when we treat our only home, our planet, and all of its non-human inhabitants like expendable resources, and we go about filling in log frames as though humanitarianism can still operate when rivers stop flowing and birds stop singing. Maybe we should stop calling ourselves humanitarians with all of its weird connotations and just start wondering what we're doing. In this room, we have people who are shaking the jargon, shaking the tree, rising to the challenge, holding states accountable, holding ourselves accountable, using privilege, looking in the mirror, getting out of the way when we need to, stepping up when we need to. We need to restore or uncover or return to, as Temri said yesterday, better ways of doing things. And I'll tell my dad that we can talk some shit in the process, but let it all start by listening. Because otherwise, as I wrote over a year ago at a moment when I thought the world couldn't get any worse, we're at risk of watering our gardens without paying attention to what's happening over the fence. Thanks a lot.